Well, you guys don't know this, but I've been talking for 10 minutes and didn't even have the record button pushed. So, well, at least I had a little bit of rehearsal. Okay, so welcome back. We're in part two of our discussion of Karl Marx, and still kind of by way of introducing you to him. Well, first I wanted to show you some pictures to kind of give you a way to associate names and faces. I always find that helpful. So here is Fred Engels, all right, 1820 to 1895. Very sort of impressive soup strainer that he's got going on there. A lot of these 19th century guys, they had really impressive facial hair. Here is Karl Marx, okay, Chuck Marx, 1818 to 1883. Picture of him, one of the more famous pictures of him in his older age. Now, I said that, in our previous lecture where we were talking about Herbert Spencer, I said that Marx and Spencer were buried in Highgate Cemetery, not too far from each other. So I wanted to show you. This is Herbert Spencer's grave in Highgate Cemetery. Okay, and this is Karl Marx's grave in Highgate Cemetery. Now, this isn't his original grave. Marx was buried in a different part of Highgate Cemetery and then reinterred here with this very impressive monument. Now, you might be asking, why is he showing us graves? Why is Dr. Santoro showing us graves? Well, one of the reasons is because I find it sort of fitting, right, that Marx and Spencer, these two diametrically opposed thinkers, diametrically opposed in their philosophies and in their politics, are buried within fighting distance of each other. But also, I wanted to show you Marx's grave because there's a quote. There's several inscriptions on his tombstone. One of them is "Workers of all countries unite." Right, and that's taken from the Communist Manifesto. I said the Communist Manifesto was more of a political polemic that he wrote that was meant to inspire political action. It was meant to inspire the workers' movement of the 19th century, this part of the 19th century. But there's another quote, there's another inscription on his gravestone, and I wanted to show it to you and read it, because I think this tells us a lot about how Marx understood his work, right? And how maybe we should understand his work too. What did he think he was doing? And he says, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it." So, the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. Very famous quote from Marx's work. And what does it mean? Now here, this is, Marx trying to tell us that, whatever it is, social science, the use of science to understand society, somehow, in this case, it's going to be Marx trying to use science to understand capitalism, right, from the point of view of workers, and provide a scientific analysis of capitalism. Why, right? To change it, right? The point is to change it, right? Social science doesn't do anybody any good if it is nothing more than contemplating your navel, right? And this was Marx's biggest gripe. This was Marx's biggest criticism of 19th century philosophy, especially German philosophy, is that these philosophers were so good at coming up with, all these kinds of fancy abstractions and so on, and ideas that had no practical application, that were not able to be used in any way, right? That they were just simply ideas for the sake of ideas, right? Ideas for the sake of thinking up ideas. If you want to look at it from one perspective, he was trying to say something about the futility of ivory tower intellectualism, right? That is just a bunch of fancy ideas without any use. And for Marx, the ideas have to have some use. They have to be tied to action. All right. Now for Marx, these are going to be tied to revolutionary action. Okay. But the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. And this can now start to bring us to his understanding of history and capitalism, because that's going to be the main thing, right? What's he working toward? Well, I think if we look at the scope of Marx's work, what he's working toward is an analysis of capitalism, right? Why? Well, in order to inform this revolutionary movement, okay? If I could, maybe I'm oversimplifying, but I think that's good enough for now. All right. So we need to understand how capitalism works, and to do that, before we can talk about how capitalism works, we need to put capitalism into some kind of a historical context. So he wants to understand how capitalism developed, where it came from, and how it developed out of societies of the past. It was a big thing to Marx, right? That societies come into being, social formations, they come into being, and eventually they give way, right, to another type of society. And then that one gives way to another type of society. So he's really thinking about where did capitalism come from? And for him, it's going to come out of the ruins of feudalism, right? But I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, so we need to understand capitalism in the context of the entire scope of human history. Okay, and we're going to say what we mean, right? What Marx meant by human history. Okay, so Marx's perspective, right? Marx's perspective on society, Marx's perspective on history, his theoretical orientation, if you will, is called, I got it written on the board back here, historical materialism. Okay, Marx was a historical materialist. Well, what does that mean? What does it mean to say he was a historical materialist? Well, to explain what historical materialism means, I think the first thing we could say is, Marx he's critical of these philosophers, right? He's critical of these German philosophers. Like, you're lucky because you guys didn't have to sit through me talking about Hegel. That would have killed you, right? But these German philosophers like Hegel and Feuerbach and Bruno Bauer and others, right, who are, especially Hegel, like coming out of this brand of philosophy that we could call idealism, right, with a capital I. And what idealists understand is that the root of history, or that what history is a manifestation of something immaterial. Okay. Like for Hegel, history was a manifestation of the unfolding of some grand idea. Okay, you get me? And Marx, Marx it talks about, well, how vague that is. Right? It's vague, right? That history is unfolding of its own will, right? History is this manifestation of some big idea, right? Marx wants to talk about real things, okay? He wants to talk about real things, stuff that's real, okay? Now, historical materialism has two words in it. It has the word history, has historical, and it has the word materialism in it, okay? So it's historical materialism, the materialist view of history, however you want to put it. And so we got to take those two words and we got to break them down, right? So materialism. What's materialism? Well, materialism is a school of philosophy that tells us that we have to understand things in terms of other things that are material, right? That are real, in other words, not vague, that are observable, empirically verifiable. Okay, we can't talk about history as divine will. We can't talk about history as the unfolding of a grand idea, right? We have to look at history as authored by human beings, okay? In real material contexts, real material circumstances, okay? That's what I mean by materialism, and that'll become even clearer as we go along. And what did Marx mean by history? Well, he meant human history, right, as opposed to natural history or something like that. Human history. So understanding human history in relationship to real things, right? Real things, real relationships. So where do we start? How do we start to understand history? We start, I'm putting this in my own words, right? We start with people. Start with people. People where? People on planet Earth. That's the material context, right, in which we're going to understand history. Human beings living living on planet Earth, okay? So human beings living in relationship to nature and in relationship to each other. And those two things, human beings in relationship to nature and human beings in relationship to each other, that's real, right? It's not vague, that's real, okay? Everybody with me so far? So I have in front of me some quotes. I have in front of me some quotes from the German ideology, all right? And I'm going to read this quote, and then I'm going to stop, and then I'm going to start another segment, okay? Because I'm going to read this quote, and then I want you to think about it, right? Before we get into part 3. So here's what Marx said in the German ideology, and to me, this is the heart of historical materialism. All right, Marx said, "We must begin by stating the first premise of all human existence, and therefore of all history, the premise, namely, that men must be in a position to live in order to make history." Okay, I'm going to give you more when we come back, but men must be in a position to live in order to make history. All right, chew on that for a little bit, and I'll see you in a few minutes.